Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. At ZEF. Thank you all for coming. I'm really grateful that you came from around the world to join in this meeting on extreme poverty and marginality. The setup is to work together. It's a meeting by invitation only, so we have not opened it up to participants. Everyone here is encouraged to engage in the topic. After a few opening remarks, I will ask you to introduce yourself, just with a few sentences, your name, your background, and so on. So I will not do individual welcoming up front to you. However, I would like to express my gratitude to those who made it possible that we are together here. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with its agricultural leader, Prabhu Pingali, here on my right. The Volkswagen Foundation with Mr. Levermann nodding from back right. And the general ZEF donors who have contributed to the work and the mobilization of resources also. Dear colleagues, this initiative aims to provide knowledge and facilitate actions that facilitate inclusion of the poorest and marginalized into development. That's the aim. In the next few presentations, we will hear probably, and we shouldn't repeat it too many times, that poverty has declined on a global scale. The global MDG will be reached, but the poorest of the poor have been left behind. Indicative of that is that the global hunger reduction goal will not be achieved. So that the poorest of the poor have been left behind is not only a shame, it's economically inefficient and unjust. That's the purpose which brings us together, to stick our heads together and our minds from very different perspectives to address this issue. We define marginality as the involuntary state of an individual or group at the edge of social, economic, ecological systems preventing access to resources, assets, services, and inhibiting development of capabilities. What a mouthful of a definition. Franz Gatzweiler will elaborate on that in his presentation. But I think we need clarity on what we mean. This is not a meeting on general poverty or above and below the lines statistics, but it's a bit more complex, and the complexity of marginality requires an equally complex set of approaches. You, the conference participants, bring a huge wealth of experience together. Many of you have worked on the issues before us for most of your professional career. So decades of experience. The grassroots, in academia, the corporate sector, the civil society organizations, governments. So I think we all can expect a lot from an open exchange across these different actors. Innovative collaborations among such different agents of change is, in my opinion, urgently needed and holds promise. The business approaches inclusive business, for instance, shared value and others, social business approaches, have tremendously expanded over the past few years. It holds promise. Civil society organizations have, of course, in the last 2 decades, been the global institutional change. There are tens and tens of thousands around the world. But also government social policy has changed. Social protection policies have come a lot deeper in the developing world. But not good enough yet. And the parallelism of these initiatives, I think, needs to be overcome. The purpose of this initiative will be laid out in a moment by a background presentation from Franz Gatzweiler. Key among those purposes is to make the extreme poor and marginalized more visible. Visible in research, in policy, and in action. We are we're into the second half of a planning phase of a project supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it's a planning phase. In that planning phase, one critical aspect is to build an international network of marginality-oriented researchers and practitioners. This meeting is part of exploring the build-up of such international network of leaders in the field. We aim at broadening the applied research community network on marginality, and one such step is, for instance, the annual international conference, this year held in Bonn, called the Tropical Day, in October of this year, under the theme of development at the margin. For that conference, more than 1,200 papers have been submitted, papers or posters. Typically 500 will be selected. This is a meeting mostly of next generation researchers, doctoral students from all over the world, some master students. And I've seen some of the submissions for this, which is in Europe an important event, and I'm delighted that the focus on marginality is expanding quickly, more quickly than I had expected. And I just take this as an example. In the planning phase, we have had extensive collaboration and a lot of exchange in 2 pilot or partner countries in Ethiopia and Bangladesh. I'm particularly pleased with the strong contingencies from Bangladesh and Ethiopia here at the table. If research-oriented evidence-based action doesn't work in Bangladesh and Ethiopia, it ain't work anywhere. So that's where we have to have learning experiences, and a lot of that will be shared in this meeting. Let me preview the conference a little bit. This first day will focus on concepts, theory, characteristics, causal relationships of marginality and extreme poverty. And in the afternoon, Bangladesh and Ethiopia will come to the forefront. Second day, tomorrow, we'll explore possible intervention strategies and policies to support the marginalized poor. So strategies and programs, investments, including participatory approaches with the poor, so this is not just on the poor, will be focused on tomorrow. The half day on Wednesday will be a development practitioners and private sector exchange forum with academia. At the end of the conference, we have kept time and room to form little round tables for those who are interested, and we will convey, those are sort of extended luncheon tables on Wednesday. I think it's a civil society table, it's one on business and one on concepts and strategies or so. But that will be shaped in the context of the next 2 days. We didn't want to pre-program too much. The dynamics of this conference is in your hands. Thank you for sending papers and PowerPoints. We will assemble, edited by you, and comment a bit, but we will assemble a proceedings volume in interaction with those of you who engage in that. This evening we will have a dinner off-site here, and logistics for that will be explained later on, Franz, I understand. Bonn, of course, is a federal city. It's a city of ZEF. By the way, there are also quite a number, more than a dozen United Nations organizations in town. But primarily Bonn is the city of Beethoven, the musician. He was born here. There's a little museum, which actually is quite nice. For those of you who feel visiting Beethoven's house, we would facilitate that tomorrow right after the conference ends, sort of 5 o'clock or so. We will circulate a note, and you can mark whether you are available and interested in that. There would be a little English guided tour, I understand. So that's downtown. Would take you about an hour, including transport, to go and have a look. Well, colleagues, thank you again for coming. Let's get to work. I would like to suggest we do a quick round of introduction. Akhtar, can we start with you?
Good morning. I'm Akhtar Ahmed. I'm a senior research fellow in the International Food Policy Research Institute in the Poverty, Health and Nutrition Division. And recently I moved to Bangladesh to run a project there on food policy issues. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Franz Gatzweiler. I'm a senior scientist here at ZEF and principal investigator for the Marginality Project.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joy Kiru from the University of Nairobi, where I'm a lecturer. Most importantly, I was a student at ZEF, living at 007. I work in microfinance and rural development. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Sudarshan Srinivas. I come from Mumbai in India, from Reliance Foundation, and I'm a direct practitioner in the terms of working with about 1,500 marginal farmers in 300 villages across India. Thank you.
Hisham Ahmed from the London School of Economics, also affiliated with ZEF, and I guess as part of a career in Bretton Woods institutions, working on social programs and public finance.
I'm Julie from Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Beijing.
I am Masud Ahmed from BRAC's Research and Evaluation Division. I am working with the entrepreneur program of BRAC.
My name is Pushpam Kumar. I'm Chief Economist at UNEP in Nairobi. As a researcher, I work on valuation and accounting of ecosystem services and also the dynamics of the incidence of poverty and ecosystem services. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Nusha Chaudhary. I'm from World Food Program. I work on the food security analysis and mapping of the poor in WFP.
Good morning. I'm Krista Veda. I'm the WFP Country Director in Bangladesh. World Food Program Country Director in Bangladesh. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Belby Groh, working at ZEF. I'm working on mapping marginality in the MARGIP project.
Good morning, I'm Bertel Virchow. I'm the Executive Manager of the Food Security Center of the University Hohenheim in Stuttgart.
Good morning, my name is Inga Korte. I'm a statistician and I'm also part of the MARGIP project here at ZEF.
Good morning, my name is Gabriele Harrer. I come from Malik Management in Switzerland. We are developing especially tools to make system analysis in complex systems of all kind. And we develop also the sensitivity model, Professor Fester, which the ZEF is already using since some years. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Manasi Kumar. I'm a psychologist by training. I'm a staff member in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Nairobi. And I'm very interested on issues such as psychology of poverty and how to make sense of the experience of marginality from people's point of view.
Good morning, my name is Ingo Ritz. I'm Executive Director of NET's Partnership for Development and Justice, a German Bangladesh network. We are focusing on extreme poor families since 2002.
Wolfgang Klevermann, good morning. I'm from the Volkswagen Foundation in Hanover. The Volkswagen Foundation is the biggest private funding institution in Germany in the area of research and academic teaching. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Christine Ladenbrugge. I'm also working at ZEF in the MARGIP project with a focus on the private sector engagement to reduce extreme poverty.
Good morning, my name is Taddasaur Damaren Gole. I'm Director of the Environment and Coffee Forest Forum in Ethiopia and working on conservation related research as well as rural development.
Good morning, my name is Heike Baumüller. I'm also part of the MARGIP project here at ZEF. I'm also looking in particular at the role of business in marginality reduction.
I'm Shatter from the Center for Development Research. I'm also a senior academic here.
Niels Christiansen with the Nestle Creating Shared Value Advisory Board, helped to guide the company's efforts in nutrition, water, and rural development.
My name is Ulrich Hiemens. I'm an economist and currently fellow at ZEF. I used to keep the chair of Joachim warm while he was visiting.
I'm Solva Gerke. I'm co-director here at ZEF, heading the Department of Political and Cultural Change. I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm working on knowledge and development, and actually also on migration and integration in Southeast Asia.
Good morning, my name is Mike Roberts. I work for an NGO called International Development Enterprises. We have programs in about a dozen countries around the world, mainly focused on market development in rural areas.
My name is Tom Arnold. I'm Chief Executive of Concern Worldwide, an international NGO. We work in about 25 countries. We have a particular focus on the poorest and most marginal, and we have long-standing programs in Bangladesh and Ethiopia.
I'm
I'm Sajjad Zohir from Bangladesh. I have a background in economics, worked at BITS, which is Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies, but since last 5 years I've been working with Economic Research Group.
Good morning. It's Andri Statori from the Institute of Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. We're an organization that focuses mostly on the politics of food and food systems in sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa specifically.
Good morning. I'm Mustafa Almasi. I'm from Ethiopia. I work at the Ethiopian Economics Association. I'm the director of a research institute within the Ethiopian Economics Association. I used to be a fellow at ZEF with Yorgi.
Good morning. I'm Prabhu Pengali with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I'm the Deputy Director for Agriculture Development at the Foundation. And prior to coming to the Gates Foundation, I was the Chief Economist at FAO, and prior to that I spent 15 years with the CGIAR system. From the Foundation side, we are delighted to be sponsoring this conference and also to be sponsoring the project itself.
My name is Mahbub Hussain. I'm the Executive Director of BRAC, Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, which is the largest civil society organization in Bangladesh. We also work in 9 countries outside Bangladesh. I'm a development economist by training.
I am Sukhabir Thorat. I am a professor of economics at the Center for the Study of Regional Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, for the last 30 years or so. I am also the chairman of Indian Council of Social Science Research, which looks after promoting research in social sciences in the country. And lastly, I am managing trustee of Indian Institute of Dalit Studies, which undertake research on social exclusion, discrimination, and its consequences on economic growth and poverty of the multiple discriminated group in India and also in Asia. Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Tekinet Awao. I'm from Ethiopia. I work in Ethiopian Economic Association. I'm a researcher on poverty and related issues. Thank you.
I am Abhar Muhammad Saiful Islam from Bangladesh. I'm assistant professor at the Department of Agriculture Economics at Bangladesh Agriculture University. I will start my PhD at ZEF from August 2011. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Manfred Denisch. I'm a biologist by training, and currently I am the acting director here at ZEF of the Department for Ecology and Natural Resource Management.
Thank you. Franz, you're on. Colleagues, please stick to time. And in this first session, will be the one who will wave with a piece of paper at some point when time is up. And I ask the chairs of the coming sessions to do the same. We really want to reserve lots of time for discussion. Franz, please.
Thank you, Joachim, for the warm welcome. Dear colleagues, guests, the point of departure for the MARGIP project was the confusion over what marginality actually means from the perspective of different scientific disciplines, and the frustration over the fact that poverty, especially extreme poverty, below the line, despite substantial efforts in research and action to overcome it, persists, especially in remote rural areas, among socially excluded groups and those extreme poor in belongings. With ZEF as an interdisciplinary research center and the expertise of social, economic, and natural scientists under one roof, we felt particularly committed to that challenge. The MARGIP project therefore aims at better identifying and locating the marginalized poor, understanding the causes of extreme poverty, revealing the needs and potentials of the marginalized and poor, and matching them with suitable investments, innovations, and actions for and with the poorest. Who are we talking about when we talk about the marginalized and poor? We are talking about the extreme poor, the poor below the poverty line, and those who are also marginalized in rural areas of developing countries. Although there are fluctuations between the groups, we direct our attention to those who are marginalized and poor in rural areas of low and middle income countries. It may be useful to keep in mind that we start with a definition of the poor who are mainly poor in assets and measured in absolute terms, for example, below the $1 line, whereas the marginalized are those who live at the margin of social and ecological systems. This broadens the definition of poverty and leads to a more comprehensive and inclusive concept. This diagram wants to illustrate the same as the previous, except that the marginality circle is divided into two circles: the socially excluded and the geographically remote, and those living on environmentally degraded lands and landscapes. Our target group are those living in remote or environmentally degraded areas who are socially excluded, discriminated, and poor. To which extent someone needs to fall into all these dimensions in order to qualify as marginalized poor will remain an interesting question. But before that stands the question, which causal patterns of marginality can be discovered among the poorest, and where are the levers to trigger a process out of extreme poverty? So after looking at poverty and marginality from many different angles, we eventually came up with a definition of marginality, which Joachim already mentioned, which defines marginality as an involuntary position and condition of an individual or group at the margin of social, political, economic, ecological, and biophysical systems, preventing access to resources, assets, services, rights, restraining freedom of choice and capabilities, and thereby causing extreme poverty. Oh, I think you can't see very much. I'm sorry for that. Maybe we can switch off the light in front here and just... Yeah. Yes, a little bit better. Thank you. So if we try to visualize someone being marginalized and poor, but you will find this diagram also in our working paper. It is the individual X4 in this diagram who is at the margin of the food, health, and political system, meaning that he or she is undernourished, suffers from disease, and has no voice in decision making, in this case, as an example. But she may be embedded, at least to a certain degree, into social systems which enable her to survive. An important criteria for being marginalized is that the individual or group is involuntarily in such a situation and aims at escaping X4 in this case, in order to move somewhere closer to the fat red dot. That is the same individual, just less poor and less marginalized in this diagram. X1, X2, and X3 are dots which are centers of the food, health, and political systems. So for a more detailed description of how we conceptualize the marginalized poor, please also look at the working paper we've come up with. To give some examples of those who are not considered as belonging to the group of the marginalized poor, for example, those who are poor in assets but included into functioning social systems or programs which also secures them from suffering from hunger and disease. Or those who are socially excluded or discriminated but economically included and well off. Or another group, those who are remote and excluded from the formal economy and excluded from public services, and maybe they would also be socially excluded if they were not so remote. For example, indigenous groups who live in resource-rich environments have functioning social-cultural systems and do not perceive themselves at the margin of any other society or economy. They are not in an involuntary situation. By the standards of others, and from the perspective of others, they may be marginalized and poor though, but not from their own perspective. The viewpoint of the assumably poor and marginalized is therefore very important. Surprisingly, the marginalized poor themselves are aware of their situation and can describe it like this narrative by an ultra-poor woman selected by Braque's program for the ultra-poor, who says, "We are caught up in a complex knot. Other people are also caught up from time to time in a knot, but their knots are simpler." And the knot is a symbol for complexity, of course. You can easily detect the source of that knot and do something about it, but our knots have many sources. Often pulling one string carelessly only makes the knot more complex. And the authors of that paper who cite this ultra-poor lady conclude what overlaps with our definition of marginalized and poor, that the extreme poor are not only poorer than the poor, but their poverty is also structurally different. These structural differences are reflected in what we have termed marginality patterns, causal patterns of factors which lead to extreme poverty and which differ from case to case. And both the marginality patterns and extreme poverty can be self-enforcing, which is indicated by the arrow on the left side. This slide wants to show how conceptually marginality patterns, needs and potentials need to be matched with suitable interventions, and how change needs to be managed for the benefit of the marginalized poor, how we have conceptualized it. Change can be brought about by stimulating endogenous drivers, by changing the exogenous circumstances which keep the marginalized and poor from changing, or both. Key for us is a better understanding of the lives of the poorest. Living at the brink of survival has forced many to be excellent and innovative risk managers and strategists. They are confronted with the challenges to find food, stay healthy, partner with others, and save money, even they seem to have no money, from close to nothing, it seems. No money, no education, no social status, and no political voice. But that is what has been overlooked, maybe. Many of the poorest are innovative risk managers. That is an important ingredient for social entrepreneurship, and where both may meet. From this characterization of the marginalized poor, we have derived some methodological needs for a future research and action program, which I have listed here. Important ingredients are participation, to address complexity and dynamics. And finally, there remain challenges, of course. We are just at the beginning, so it's not a surprise. Some of the most pressing challenges are, and we will define more throughout the conference, are to identify who and where the marginalized poor are in rural areas, and whether they leave, move in or out, or remain in extreme poverty. Another challenge is that we need a better understanding of the needs and potentials of the marginalized poor, that we need to reduce transaction costs for matching marginality patterns and innovative entrepreneurial solutions, or building and managing partnerships across local, national, and global levels. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Franz. We want to move right on to the next presentation and discuss at the end. Next is Satyat Sahir. Well, let me clarify. 15 minutes max. I will warn you at minute 12 and wave with 3 fingers, meaning 3 minutes left. Yeah?
Thank you. There is no 1 minute warning, right?
No.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try to be as brief as possible and try to communicate, because one of the participants here warned me that I wasn't very clear in the paper that I had sent out to ZEF. But I'll try to be provocative, because this session, I understand, is meant to be that. And I will pick up from what Franz had started off. A few points regarding marginalized being at the margin of social and ecological system, and poor, as in poor in assets, does create a problem in terms of the independence of the two things, because you are being poor, meaning you're at the margin in terms of the asset scale. There is obviously the diagram that was shown, which goes for the intersection of 3 things: marginalized, poor, and the social exclusion. And if we talk about marginalized poor being the intersection of the 3 sets, that would imply that you only focus on socially excluded. Unless you are loose enough in defining social exclusion, you'd run into a problem. But I'm going to pick up a few of those things, that's why I'm referring to those things. Then there was a reference about spheres, food, politics, and a few other things, and I thought one has to look into the sphere of engagement and how robust we can be in terms of defining or identifying the relevant spheres to address the issue of whether you call it excluded group, economically excluded, or otherwise excluded, or you call about marginality. And then finally, there was a long list of prescription on interventions and innovations, which I do not get into, because mine is more at a general level and would focus on only the generic type. This is page down is, okay, thank you. I have been fumbling between 2 entry points. One is doing research in the field of development economics, NGOs, MFIs, and few other social protection kind of things. There are issues that came up, and there are issues that I was fumbling with coming from economics background in terms of the way to approach things. And I have this general feeling, which some of us at Economic Research Group with the Research and Evaluation Division in BRAC together had put together a paper on exclusion and an analytical approach, basically exclusion and poverty. But that's the first attempt we made, trying to focus on how one can get away from the literature, which is partly dominated by sociologists, and those of the economists who engaged in those areas use terms which are not the textbook economics languages were used. So we fell back on the demand supply kind of tools, try to understand what one could make out of those tools. So the basic outline I have is, I feel that we discuss about exclusion or marginality or any other such terms in different disciplines in different languages. And if we want to build a common understanding about the subject, possibly it's better to go back to the core principles. So I fall back on core principles, which I started off thinking as economic principles, and then later realized that is the core principles in many other disciplines, basically the broad social science, and one may go back into the broad political philosophy, the post-Renaissance of political philosophy. Then from the concept of exchange and contract, I have some ideas that one can think through. And what I gather is there are 2 ways to think through. One is a very ex-ante approach in terms of thinking, like when you go to design a program, we think about what exists and how do we make an intervention. So that's a like the business model kind of thing. When there is no product in existence, you think of a product, you think of a service, which possibly will re-establish new form of contract, new form of services, which will address some bit of exclusion, reduce exclusion. And there is this exposed kind of perception, which economists are too familiar with, where the market for goods and services are already there. You try to think through a designing program.
I think we just have to push it back. More distance, yeah.
Where you basically have the exposed kind of perception where the markets exist and you try to intervene in that market and do something about it. Those two approaches I actually get into. First thing is the fact that over the years development practitioners have been working to address targeted group who were perceived to be outside the net, and meant that there were ways to actually reduce exclusion. So exclusion is not a rigid thing, and that is the basis, the whole rationale of addressing exclusion in an alternative way. I did mention about these core principles because I find going back to the core principles is an essential first attempt to reconstruct the ideas regarding what exclusion is. Three basic principles that I'm suggesting, which is very common knowledge to most people in economics. But if you ask them, a neoclassicist wouldn't define it this way. They would immediately identify agents as individuals, not thinking about that agents could be even classes. So basic analytical category called agent is used, which could be anything, even political parties. Each agent is assumed to have predefined objective. You then go for defining rationality in a more loose terms in terms of pursuit of those objectives. And the third is exchanges, which is the Pareto thing everybody is familiar with from different disciplines. Exchanges take place between agents under a power relation when there is gains made by the parties in exchange. And then what a contract is, the way I'm seeing it, is the exchange is transactions on both ways of particular goods and services, and those including the terms under which those exchanges take place together form what we call a contract. And the reason I'm getting into this notion is, see, contracts, and when we talk about exchanges, we differentiate between different kinds of market, non-market, motivated by social passion and few other things, philanthropic things. We go on talking about it, but for the construction, there's an extreme assumption I make here, is basically following, if somebody has read Marcel Mauss's The Gift, would know what those gifts are driven by. You know, the prestations are driven by self-motive. And that's a very basic assumption. Whether it's a short term, long term, whether it's a, you know, our, even the philanthropic attitude towards our neighbors or a security guard or somebody working for me, I take that extreme assumption being driven by self-interest. And finally, the observed arrangements of contracts among multiple agents in multiple spheres is considered to be an equilibrium outcome of what we identified as the three core principles. So that is considered, whatever we are observing, rather than putting our value judgment on it, we consider that as an equilibrium to try to think through how do you bring about changes in that equilibrium if we want to, because that automatically means that exclusion, whatever way we define, or marginality, is an outcome of, is an equilibrium outcome of the existing, you know, the agents, the objectives they have, and the kind of exchanges and power relations that exist. So if you want to bring about changes in that contract and reduce exclusion, then there has to be, it's like the economists think about comparative statistics. So the extended perspective is in terms of contracts, and exclusion in a given sphere is defined as the presence of an agent with whom no viable contract may be defined involving other agents in the society in that particular sphere. So we may be engaging with the scheduled caste in certain spheres, but may decide to not engage in some other spheres. Scheduled castes doesn't mean that they don't engage in exchanges with the rest of the society in all spheres of the life. The exposed perspective is the general definition of exclusion applies to the subset of contracts that manifest in the forms of goods and services exchanged between providers or producers and consumers at prices that ensure net benefits to both parties. This is the way economists are trained to think through. I don't get into this thing. Here is a small example I'll throw in terms of the extent of thinking of program design. We were thinking of, given the current contract between household heads, I'm saying urban household heads, who employ domestic workers and who live in an apartment environment, which is a community I'm defining. And under that kind of arrangement, what we observe that the current contract doesn't allow the domestic workers to engage in or avail education services. So if we say this group is excluded from availing education services, I consider that as an equilibrium outcome of the prevailing contract between all the parties in all other spheres. Then the question is, how do we bring about the change? And initially one has to understand what is the nature of contract between all these parties. Why is the outcome such that the employers wouldn't like to send out their domestic help to avail education? And then try to think through. I'm not getting into the details. If there is time, we can get into the discussion. But the extent of perception of addressing exclusion is to assume that whatever is existing, the Hegelian saying, is rational, and what we say is an equilibrium. We have to either introduce new agent, change influence objectives, or change constraint resource environments, technology, delivery mechanism being cost effective, and thereby bring about a change in the nature of the contract. This is the formalization of that part. Basically, you use the concept of incentive compatibility to ensure that whatever contract. Then I fall back, basically when we have the defined goods and services is actually a subset of the broader notion of contract. And you could think of a demand function, which there are all these variables which could be additional. P is the price received by provider, C is the additional direct cost to be paid by consumers, and something that overlaps with what Frank was mentioning regarding the transaction cost, which I was referring to as delivery cost. Then you can address different types of exclusion. One is the voluntary choice-based, under some assumptions. Second is due to lack of awareness. Third is what we say about the opportunity cost. I mean, somebody is not being able to send their children to schools because the children has to work for something else which is adds more value to the family. That's, we say, for survival. Exclusion for survival is when you could work through in the equation. Fourth exclusion is the lack of effective demand, which economists are too much into it. One could actually get into then moving to the social exclusion. If you think that social exclusion can be reduced by incurring certain costs, you could do that and then work out. Obviously, one has to understand the process. Without undermining the process, I'm suggesting that one can think through what social exclusion is in that framework. And then the general case which addresses social exclusion as well as the one distance in a broader, distance can be defined in many different ways. Friends refer to distance. That's the very general case caused by distance. So those are the 5 different kinds of exclusion. And I have a list of things, if you look into the paper, which mentions that the ways you can, going back to the same demand-supply kind of construct, how would you reduce such exclusions? And finally, because I've been given the warning, is the last part talks about segmentation, which is essentially if you engage in delivering a new service, and if the original one is in equilibrium, you end up introducing a differentiated product, otherwise you cannot reach the excluded. That's a very critical thing which the development discourse hasn't yet engaged in, but my understanding is
we have to think through these segmentation issues very seriously down the road. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to bring a rigorous theoretical perspective from legal.
If it gets too irritating, just say. Good morning. Can you all hear me? Is the loudspeaker off now?
No, it's on.
It's
no.
on. Okay, and I'm not causing the crackling.
Yeah.
Hi there. I'm very honored to be here. And I'll start off with a story about the famous Sufi mystic, wise man and sage, the Mullah Nasruddin, who was found by his students one day crawling around on hands and knees in the bushes outside his house. And they said, "What's up? What's going on?" And he said, "I seem to have lost my key." And they got down on hands and knees and, like good students, tried to help their teacher find his key. And after a while, one of them asked him, "But Mullah, where were you when you dropped your key?" And I said, "Well, I was inside my house." "Well, why are you looking for it out here?" "Well, this is where the light is." I think in a way it summarizes part of my view of some of the limitations, some of the shortcomings of what is illuminated and what is not illuminated by quantitative sociological data and by poverty measurement. I've been asked to give a slightly provocative presentation to try to provoke discussion. It's also quite a complex area, and we're talking about disciplines, and as a final challenge, I've been told I've only given 15 minutes, so I'm going to be very schematic. I'm always reminded of Winston Churchill, who said, "I didn't have time to prepare a short speech, so I'll give you a long one." So forgive me if my arguments are quite schematic, and I'll draw my picture in broad strokes. To a large extent, my discussion is really focused not so much upon what poverty measurement can show and not show, as upon the uses of poverty measurement and policy knowledge in the current situation of pro-poor policy making. And I think a particular challenge is posed by a dynamic that rural sociologists sometimes like to describe as jobless de-agrarianization. The situation that Prof. Joachim von Braun described earlier, where the poorest of the poor are being left further and further behind, is in many ways being caused by a core dynamic that's happening in large parts of sub-Saharan Africa and also in various parts of Asia and Southeast Asia. A dynamic of jobless de-agrarianization, a dynamic whereby millions of people in various ways are being induced to leave agrarian employment. The dynamics are complex. And one of the interesting things that one can point out about the current phase of jobless de-agrarianization is that it is both like and unlike waves of de-agrarianization that have happened in other parts of world history. Here in Europe and in the UK, in the 18th and 19th century, we also saw a process of de-agrarianization. And one of the ways in which the current wave of de-agrarianization is like that historical episode is that it is being driven by the very nature and logic of capitalist development. It's not an accident. It is being created by the way in which the global economy is developing. In the present time, to some extent, climate change, increasing pressure on agricultural land, change in human diets. We have more people eating meat and therefore more meat animals eating grains. Increasing interest in biofuels, all driving greater pressure on agricultural land with proactive acquisition by worried governments and multinationals of agricultural land because they see it's going to be a scarce commodity. Also increasing capital intensity and intensification of agricultural competition, increasing supermarketization of the food system and increasing buyer-drivenness of agri-food value chains. All of these are causing millions and millions of people to be pushed off the land and to be shaken out of agricultural employment. But it's very different from the 18th and 19th century wave of de-agrarianization we saw in Europe. in one way, in that in Europe, the social disruption and the marginalization created by the agrarianization was a temporary phenomenon. It caused temporary social disruption because the descendants of the peasants who were pushed off the land by enclosures became the backbone of the workforce of the Industrial Revolution. And that's not happening at the moment. At the moment, those millions of people are not finding non-farm employment. At the moment, Henry Bernstein estimates, based on, I think, upon information he finds in the CIA World Factbook, that something like 1 billion people globally are finding themselves no longer able to grow their food or fulfill their full nutritional requirements from growing their own food, but unable to find employment in the non-farm economies. In South Africa, for instance, we have, partly as a result of the history of apartheid, partly as a result of the nature of economic development after apartheid, millions of people who find themselves in a very interesting double bind. And I think this complicates the picture of marginality that we've seen here. Excluded from the economy as growers of food, as traders, as workers, and as producers, but included in the economy as customers for the manufactured goods produced by the corporates at the center of the core economy. And this situation of simultaneous exclusion and inclusion is why I prefer the notion of adverse incorporation to that of marginalization. Now, this creates very interesting challenges for not just governments, but states and state-like organizations, the present-day agents of social power, whose role can sometimes be well understood by making use of the concept, I think it was developed by the French philosopher Michel Foucault, of biopolitics. By looking at biopolitics, Foucault says we should look at the way in which modern power is about the organization of the conditions of life of populations, the organization of the well-being and conditions of life of populations. Foucault, and more recently, a Canadian geographer by the name of Tanya Lee, points out that biopolitics can involve very different kind of policies. On one hand, you can have making live policies, policies that are aimed at organizing and supporting investment into the well-being and productivity of populations. Here in Germany, the home of the Wirtschaftswunderland, we have seen many decades of making live politics. And indeed, large parts of the welfare states of the North are characterized by the extent and breadth of making live politics. But that's not the only kind of policy that you can have. You can also have what Tanya Marie calls letting die policies. You can take a policy decision that you will abandon a section of the global population to fend for itself and to lead short and limited lives. My question is, what is the role of poverty measurement and quantitative sociology in these decisions, in these calculations? Now, the American political scientist observed, James C. Scott observed, that if you are a state or a state-like organization and you want to act in society, you first need to be able to see society. So that the exercise of biopolitical power requires information, requires knowledge, requires certain technologies of representation. And qualitative sociology, the quantitative sociology, the quantitative study of populations is absolutely essential for the kinds of calculations that you need to make if you are going to invest in make-live policies. So it helps the agents of social power to see vulnerable populations. It's no longer a matter of just identifying a poor community in some kind of ad hoc way. You develop systematic data sets, you develop systematic calculators that enables you to make rational and objective and justified decisions about the allocations of resources. So poverty measurement plays an absolutely essential part in the way in which modern bureaucratic power invests in make-live politics. But at the same time, for all that it is useful, poverty measurement and quantitative sociology suffers from one essential weakness, in that it tries to understand poverty and vulnerability as a characteristic of individuals. And it tries to understand poor populations as aggregations of individuals. In other words, it is blind to the complexities of social relationality. And I think that's a fairly crucial deficiency if you're trying to understand poverty. And I should remark that here, when I talk about poverty, I'm very much talking about the kind of approach to poverty initially pushed by Amartya Sen, which sees poverty as a state of social and economic disempowerment. So, not having enough money, not having enough food, not having clothing or water or shelter are all important, but they are important because they drive what really matters about poverty, which is that you are unable to be an effective social economic agent in your society. So you'll notice that this concept of poverty is very much overlapping with that marginality. It's not very distinct. It's not as if you can specify poverty over here and marginality over here and then try to find the causal relationship between them. In the same approach, poverty and marginality are greatly coterminous. And this makes it this is an aspect of poverty that is very difficult to turn into indicators and see through the lens of indicators. Joachim, how am I doing okay for time here?
I'm about to say.
Okay. Very briefly then, one of the reasons why all of this matters is that I think pro-poor policy is in a very interesting situation at present. For all that the individuals involved in making pro-poor policy and who drive attempts to do poverty reduction and even poverty eradication, I think what we see actually being achieved by these policies is something much more like the management or the government of poverty. A process in which policies are essentially treating poverty and poor populations in the globe as objects of management and objects of technocratic intervention. And I'll just say that poverty knowledge and poverty measurement is absolutely essential to this fiction that you can manage poverty. For example, the fiction that you can have a poverty line, that you can reduce poverty by moving people over that poverty line. And in South Africa we have government officials saying, and this is a word that really has me reaching for my revolver, we thereby graduate people out of poverty. And then, having graduated you out of poverty, you are no longer our problem. You can fend for yourself. At the moment, I think biopolitics is at the crossroads. The current situation in which we see increasing levels of economic and social instability, need I mention food price riots in 2008, need I mention Tahrir Square, need I mention protests in Spain, mean that the government of policy is no longer a very effective way of managing the fallout of marginalization. I think pro-poor policy stands at a crossroads, and I think we can see two very different kind of tendencies. One tendency is the securitization of poverty policy and the enlistment of poverty policy in the cause of global geopolitical containment. And at the same time, you see a kind of a broadening out of security policies. In South Africa at the moment, in our Department of National Security, we have a Directorate of Environmental, Food, Water Security, who consider poverty and food security as issues of national security, in terms to the extent that they threaten national security, which I think is quite a worrying trend, quite a conservative one. But at the same time, there are a number of interventions which are pushing the radicalization of make-live politics, who are trying to broaden make-live politics to engage with these marginalized populations. I'm very glad to see, for example, that later we will have an intervention by Prof. David Hume, who's going to talk about their just give money to the poor, which in a way is a radicalization of the kinds of make-live politics we found elsewhere. I think this poses huge challenges towards poverty knowledge, because it means that we have to bring relationality, social power relations and economic power relations into poverty knowledge. I don't think it is well captured by trying to model the behavior of rational self-interested individuals. I'm sure we can have a discussion about this. And I think it poses a particular challenge to the states and state-like organizations. There's a reason why large data sets and quantitative knowledge is so popular. It's a kind of knowledge that is easy to use, It's very portable. It's easy to engage with it's very easy to get policy traction on it. How do you get, say, for example, the regional vulnerability assessment committees of the South African Development Corporation to understand the complexities of poor people's situation, modern buyer-driven value chains? It's a much more sophisticated, much more elusive, much more tricky kind of knowledge to build into policy. Often it's not about developing data sets or GISs, but building certain kinds of analytical skills and abilities into organs of state which are unfortunately often strapped of capacity and without resources. So this was a quick tour of some of the challenges that I see faced by poverty measurement. And I think it's very important for us to think about how our knowledge is being used, to what ends is it being used by the modern agents of global power. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Andres. Yes, I think you have provoked many of us. Maybe the security aspect which you pointed at is an opportunity. The NATO parliamentarian meeting 2 weeks ago had the issue which you referred to on its agenda. Well, if humanitarian and altruistic drives are not enough, maybe security concerns can drive better and more coherent action for extreme poverty reduction. Itisham, you're next.
Switch it on again. Andres has a strong voice, but Itisham had a fever, so let's see if he is better with the mic.
Thank you, Joachim. You're giving me an impossible task of talking about macro, fiscal and intergovernmental issues in 10 pages and 15 minutes. I'll try and do justice, but it's a difficult set of issues, albeit a very interesting one, and I'll talk to it given personal experiences in 3 parts of the world, recently in Mexico, in Pakistan, security relationships there, and in West Africa, in the rainforests of Cameroon. I'll talk about how one reaches the poorest and marginalized, building on the work that France and Christine and Joachim have been talking about in their paper. I'll talk about the macro and then the fiscal instruments and then some intergovernmental issues associated, and come up with some suggestions for further research and policy work. How does one reach the poorest? Well, we have an excellent typology in the paper. I will not go into that. I just take that as given. But draw on a conclusion that marginalized are people who do not figure in the preferences of local officials, or even sometimes national officials. So that's the first issue. And then the question is, if you're trying to reach people who don't feature in the preference functions of either central or local officials, what sort of instruments do you have? And whose instruments? Who implements these instruments? And how do they finance these instruments? And the interesting questions come about through the interactions. Preferences, the instruments, and the financing. We start with the issue of the baka. The baka are also known as the pygmies in the rainforests of West Africa. And what we see in this context is the interesting interplay between the macro, the fiscal, and intergovernmental. The baka are given, well, let me backtrack a little. In a sense, what you have in Cameroon is decentralization in the forest regions where they get a share of the forest revenues. This is to prevent deforestation and to keep the environment hospitable to the baka. Trouble is that during the financial crisis, the central government slashed by half the sharing percentage for the forest revenues. This had a major impact on local governments. And of course, the local governments, to begin with, had no interest in the matter. And when you have such wide variation in shared revenues, they don't have any own revenues, there's even less interest. And the question is, what does that do to the incentives to provide services to the backer? And of course, on top of that, there are incentives to divert any resources coming from higher levels of government or from donors. Can one think of building oportunidades type programs? Now remember, oportunidades, even though it's been talked about as a success story, including by people in this room, has problems. It's a central program which cuts across local responsibilities, and some of the disincentive effects are coming through the interactions with the labor market. In a sense, what you have is a universal program that identifies need very well, but is financed by a tax on formal labor through the payroll tax. So in a sense, what you get with the oportunidades financing is an increasing informality in the formal labor market. And this causes a major problem. And at the same time, you have a problem on the macro side, in that the Mexican tax system is full of holes for distributional purposes. For VAT and corporate income tax have all sorts of exemptions for distributional purposes. They don't work. So in a sense, you have the worst of two worlds. You have a good program, which actually reaches the poor, financed in a bad way, leading to undesirable consequences, what Santiago Levy calls good intentions with bad outcomes. He's the chap who designed this program. And we are in the middle of a research proposal design to look at the interaction of social policy and financing instruments, covering 3 parts of the world, China, South Asia, other Latin American countries as well. So the question really is that given the problems with financing, can you do better? Can you do better if you were to better design linkages between tax policy and social policy design and vice versa? South Asia has tried to copy the oportunidades. In Pakistan is what I'll talk about in a moment. But also in India, you have central programs which are implemented at the state level. Your NREGA program, for instance, provides an employment guarantee. It's financed from the center. But there's poor information on who does what. And given the lack of standardized information, a number of states, there is a huge problem of diversion of resources. And my good friend Jean Drez is going around trying to do social action to make sure that these programs are not actually diverted from, or the resources are not diverted from what they were meant to be. But given the absence of standardized information across states, it's hard to do. And in the Pakistan case, where you have an example of oportunidades, which is clearly a conditional cash transfer in the name of the leader of a political party, it's clientelism at its worst. So this is really an example of oportunidades being used in a political economy context for the re-election of a particular party. In addition to what Bardhan and Mukherjee call capture. So it's going to rich or well-connected people, and the leakages are enormous. So what we have in many parts of the world are incomplete tax instruments that lead to undesirable financing mechanisms, whether it's deficit financing or the payroll taxation in Mexico. And what is really important for poverty reduction is that subnational governments don't have proper own source tax handlers. And with a few examples, Brazil being one of them. So really, summarizing on the policy side, in order to have proper social policy design, you need to have the right incentives. at all levels of government. The trouble is that local governments don't have properly designed responsibilities in many parts of the world. And with incomplete instruments, financing is a problem. You can get incentives for greater marginalization and weakness of general revenues. And quite often, the problem is compounded because you have intergovernmental transfers that increase dependency and remove any incentive for local governments to provide efficient services or provide information for standardization. Coming to intergovernmental considerations, this is the key, because quite often, in many cases, the provision of public services for the marginalized is at the local level. But do local politicians have their own preferences? No own source revenues and untied transfers that will work. So if it were the case that local governments had the interests of the poorest and marginalized at heart, then giving transfers to these local governments, untied transfers would work, or shared revenues. But the trouble is that they don't. And if they don't, then earmarking transfers without full information doesn't work either. This is the case of Nareda. Or the case in China in the 1990s, central government was earmarking transfers, lacked the capability or information on where the monies were going, and they were going to different objectives. So without full information, and particularly if the transfer is one-off, the likelihood of leakage is very high. If it is a repeated transfer, then you can think of withdrawing the benefit in later periods if certain objectives are not met. And indeed, this might work if the benefits are not only confined to the marginal groups, and may work for investment projects. But the question really arises, and I did a paper for UAKIM's 2020 vision on this subject. But the question really is, if you are thinking about the marginalized, who don't actually enter into the preference function of local governments anyway, then is the threat of withholding funds for these people credible? Probably isn't. So the question arises, well, in this circumstance, what do you do? Well, you start off by trying to align incentives, clarify responsibilities, make sure that there is better governance at the local level, own source revenues at the margin, and standardized information, which is information on the functions of local government, on the economic characteristics, financing, and the outcomes. And then also some political pressure to bear on local officials and implementing agencies. So, given that context, what do you focus on? It's best if one had some characteristics identifiable, like age, disability, and employment status, and assets, and defining which level of government, whether it's center or local, and ensuring that there are hard budget constraints, and then how the delivery is to be monitored. I think these are the key elements. Who does what and what are the outcomes is critical, and in order to manage this, it's surprising how few countries really have functions defined. We were in Cameroon. Cameroonians did not have a functional classification. Indian government does not provide economic and functional classification at the subnational level. The Chinese have just begun to do that. So standardized GFS, this is the IMS, Government Financial Statistics standards, together with UN's functions of government, these are the standards. These should be used together with programs and sub-programs as components. And then you have the budget, accounting, and reporting information. It's providing the elements for yardstick competition to work, so that you can look at what's happening in one jurisdiction as opposed to what is being done in the neighboring jurisdictions. And you can focus on outcomes, and that's quite useful, but this is quite often only possible in very advanced countries. And if you don't have the building blocks that I've talked about earlier, then the outcomes is practically useless, because they don't really mean very much. You then end up comparing apples and oranges. And this is a typical example of what a information system would look like. And if you were thinking of, say, these are the functions, those are the economic characteristics, and here you have various programs of central government or local governments. And this would be handled by municipalities. You really need the full matrix of information in order to examine who does what and what the outcomes are. Plus own source revenues for accountability, and make sure that your transfers are not gap filling. If they are gap filling, then you wash out any possibility of accountable governance at the local level. The trouble is that quite often donors don't believe what local governments are doing either, and they set up their own funds outside the government circle. This is happening in Afghanistan in a dramatic fashion. Really, nobody knows who's spending what and what the outcomes are. Tracking where the funds go is critical, but also making sure that somebody has full information on all the funds that are being transferred or used. This is an example of a set of correspondent accounts within a Treasury single account, where you can have the operations of the local government here, say GIZ, also keep the money in the Treasury single account, the correspondent account, but use it through zero balance accounts in commercial banks. So in this case, you continue operating the way you are, but the full information goes to the one repository in the Treasury, so that somebody knows who's spending what on education and who's spending what on healthcare, and that monies are being kept together and not in thousands of bank accounts that nobody is able to monitor and that lead to rent seeking. So if the governments had the right incentives, institution and information flows, you can allow the local governments to exercise that and provide them with resources. But in the time it takes to set up the basic institutions, you may have no option but to have direct transfers, like the Oportunidad is operated by the central government. But really important thing is not to override local preferences and not to encourage rent seeking. So really, if you were to have categorical provision by the center, it's best to make it on clearly definable characteristics like age, children and women, or work tests with low wages, or Maharashtra style, or geographical targeting, and not in a manner that leads to clientelism and political opportunism, which is the way the transplantation of Oportunidad is being implemented in the Pakistan case. I think I've exhausted my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hisham. This was a big task and added a whole new set of dimensions to our opening session. The opening session would be incomplete without a human rights perspective. And I'm pleased, Katharina, that you joined us. We had a round of introduction. You may spend a moment when you introduce yourself. People just say where they come from and what drives them. So Katharina de Albuquerque is from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. Her human rights agenda relates to water and sanitation. And you have the floor. Speaking time about 10-15 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Joachim, for the invitation to be here. Sorry to be late. I couldn't land last night in Frankfurt, so I had a complicated night. But I'm very happy to be here. As you were saying, I work with the human rights to water and sanitation. I was appointed by the UN as the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights precisely to water and sanitation. What does this mean? It means that my simple task is to monitor the way in which these rights are being complied with all over the world. So as you can imagine, it's easy. I undertake country missions, and this is a hobby because I'm not paid for the work I do. And I have another job. So I go to countries, I undertake fact-finding missions to particular countries in order to see the way they are fulfilling their obligations, and then I present reports to the UN on my visits. And these are public reports that are discussed then openly with all UN member states. I also do research on topics of interest. One of them for this year, the one that I will present to the General Assembly, is precisely on money, on financing the rights to water and sanitation. So I was very interested listening to your presentation, because I'm just in the process of finalizing the report. And I am also undertaking a, for me, very interesting work of compiling good practices related to the realization of the rights to water and sanitation. I've been doing this for 3 years, and I'm going to present the compilation in September also to the UN. I also receive complaints from people, from NGOs, who are allegedly suffering violations of their human rights to water and sanitation. Today I will give the example, or use the example of the rights to water and sanitation, to bring an additional perspective of how human rights can make a difference, and do make a difference, in our struggle to reach the most excluded, the most vulnerable, the poorest people in the world. I will start by looking at the current international development agenda, which, to simplify things, I will say is materialized in the Millennium Development Goals. In order to understand how successful this international development agenda has been or is being, and what have been its achievements, what have been its gaps, and how can human rights bring something new or not. I will look then at the human rights framework, and to look at the responses, the solutions it gives in order to address the outstanding challenges. Keeping my intervention limited to the rights to water and sanitation, as you might know, the MDG target for this sector asks states to decrease by 50%, the number of people without access to water, to drinking water and sanitation. Well, to simplify things. And for me, I have a problem with a 50%, a big problem with a 50% reduction. Number one, because it is, it is a random number. It was decided to be 50%, it could be 70, it could be 30, it was 50. So always my question is, what about the remaining 50? But beyond that problem of the why 50 question, beyond that problem, my other problem is, who are the 50% people who will get access until 2015, at least in theory? Because when I go on mission, I see that governments are tempted, which I understand. If I were a government, I would maybe be tempted to. Governments are tempted to invest in the low-hanging fruits, to show quick results. Well, it's human. So the same people, the most vulnerable, the poorest, the indigenous, the people belonging to a lower caste, they are systematically excluded, or they continue to be excluded. And the investments have been made in the middle income classes. Furthermore, what I also see is a lack of incentive on governments to do more. I went, for example, to Costa Rica, and I told them, oh, but the indigenous, they don't have access. And the migrants, they don't have access. They continue not to have access. And they said, well, what's the problem? We are MDG heroes. We are meeting the MDGs, so we are fine. For the international community, we are fine. So what are you saying? And they didn't understand why I was demanding and asking questions about those who had been left out. In Egypt, I had a very interesting meeting with a minister because, well, I'm a lawyer, and I had been told that over 95% of the population had access to water. And then I went to visit slums, and nobody had access to water. Well, according at least to the Joint Monitoring Program indicators. And that's why I was saying I'm a lawyer. I was putting the numbers together, and it didn't match. The 95% with the people I had seen. It wasn't possible. And then when I met again with that minister, I said, but Mr. Minister, it doesn't match. Because the people in the slums, they don't get access. Answer, they don't count. They are illegal. I see the positive side of the current development agenda. It has been able to put many issues on the international agenda, poverty reduction, for example, but also the rights to water and sanitation, reduction of maternal mortality, etc., etc. It has been able to raise funds for these different issues. But the problems, the persisting problems, are so huge that I ask myself, is this why we are working so hard? Is this why we are investing such important sums of money? To bring access to those who already are relatively well off? If we are worried about the marginalized, if we are worried about the poorest of the poor, about those who are systematically forgotten and have no voice, why are we failing to target them and to help them? From a human rights angle, I systematically ask who is left out and why, and where is the money being invested. And if we don't ask these questions, if we only reach the low-hanging fruits, as I was saying before, we will be perpetuating discrimination. And discrimination is simply prohibited by human rights law. Human rights, I think, help us to look at particular barriers that are sometimes invisible and don't allow people to gain access. For example, administrative barriers. As I was saying in Egypt, if you want to get a water connection, you have to have a birth certificate. Well, poor people living in rural areas or living in illegal slums, they don't have the birth certificates. So it seems very logical, it can seem very logical and harmless to request a birth certificate, but, well, it can mean that people don't have access. The geographic barriers, for example, I was on mission in Bangladesh, and the people in the Chittagong hill tracts, are among some of the people in the country which have the largest deprivation, namely when it comes to access to water and sanitation. And in this case, the geography overlaps with ethnic origins, and, well, the same happens with other countries that I visited. Then we also have physical barriers, where the design of solutions excludes the most marginalized people. And to change a little bit the type of examples that I'm giving, I will mention Japan, where schools are not designed, where not all schools are designed in a way as to make sure that people with disabilities can have proper access to the facilities. So what happens in case someone has a child with disabilities and wants her to go to school? It means that one of the parents has to stay in school during the day in order to bring the child to the bathroom if he needs it, which might happen during the whole day. The same in the USA, where I saw public restrooms being shut down, for example in California, as a measure, a very intelligent measure, to get rid of homeless people. And and then on the other hand, they criminalize open defecation and open urination. They even make it a sexual offense. So people are caught in a complicated situation. So this is about the physical barriers. And then we have the gender barriers. And as you know, women and girls are the ones that invest most time in collecting water for the whole family. Girls often stop going to school when they start to be menstruated, just because there are no sex-segregated toilets in school. There are also financial barriers. For example, when the services are simply too expensive and people cannot afford them. So I think that human rights give in fact a better response, and they give solutions to reach all these people who face all the barriers that I was mentioning. Number one, human rights have, I think they give a higher degree of legitimacy to what we are vindicating. And why do I say that they give a higher degree of legitimacy? Simply because human rights are law. They are binding on states. Non-discrimination is not simply a good idea. It is imposed by law, it is prohibited, it is a human rights violation. So if we go to a country and if we see systematic patterns of exclusion, which I always see when I go on a mission, this is called discrimination. This is prohibited by law. This is a human rights violation, full stop. And there are consequences, legal consequences. Number two, human rights, they bring and they have a normative content. For example, they say for water and sanitation that solutions to be found in the area of water and sanitation must be accessible to people, they must be readily available, they must be affordable, they must be of quality. I'm not saying that it has to be state-of-the-art design and technology, but they must make sure that people don't get ill because they are drinking a certain water and people don't have contact with their own feces when they go to the toilets. And they must also be culturally, socially acceptable. For example, this brings me back to the school example, where girls stop going to school simply because there are no sex-segregated toilets. So there is a cultural factor or in this issue. Thirdly, human rights have contain some cross-cutting principles of participation, access to information, transparency, which are more than words, I think, and enable more sustainable interventions. And I can give you examples. There was an interesting story I heard. I forgot where it had taken place, where a donor decided to install water taps inside homes in a certain village, because the women had to walk a long distance to a water fountain where they washed their clothes, they washed their dishes, they collected water to bring home. And then after this big investment, the women continued to go to that water point. Why? Because it was a way for them to have some privacy and to be among themselves, to chat, to gossip, to be away from the husbands. So that's why they continued to do it. If there had been participation, maybe the women would have said, we want to walk a little bit from outside our homes, maybe not that much as now, but we want to be among ourselves. So the intervention would have been much more useful, much more sustainable, if the women had participated, if the women had been heard. And to finalize, for me, human rights empower people. With human human rights, we don't look at water and sanitation interventions as simple charity, something or a good idea that we can give now and take away tomorrow. They are much more than that. They are rights that people can claim, and on a very personal note, that's what I see when I go to countries where this is the case, when the rights are recognized. People feel empowered. People feel that they can claim the right. They have a door to knock on to claim the right. And to finalize, I will just give you an example concerning Egypt. There is a very interesting, for me, interesting NGO, which is financed. It's a very small NGO, financed with money coming from the European Commission. And what do? They work in a slum in Cairo, and it's a huge slum with hundreds of thousands of people living there. So the NGO is small, doesn't have much money. What did they do? They brought water and sanitation to 6 families. And because they don't have the money to bring all water and sanitation to everyone. And what do they then do? They bring the rest of the people in the slum to those apartments to visit them and to see how people's lives have changed since they got access to water and sanitation. The girls go to school, the women work, they have less diarrhea, etc., etc. They are not under the threat of being raped because they walk out to fetch water. And then what does the NGO tell the other people in the slum? This is a right. Go and claim it. These are the entities that are responsible for providing it, knock on their doors, and that's what they are doing. So I think that human rights have this immense potential of empowering people, making people aware of their rights, and chasing them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Katharina, for giving us the human rights perspective. Actually, I think it's a very powerful argument from a lawyer pointing in simple terms at the big disincentive arising from the 50% goals of the Millennium Development Goals, working against the extreme poor. We actually shouldn't be surprised that under the MDG regime over the last 12 years or 11 years, progress in poverty reduction measurement was the least the further away you are from the line. It's an extremely important message how MDG redesign should be worked out post-2015. And I actually see no reason why we should wait until 2015 with redesign. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's as random a number as a 50, the 2015. Thank you for bringing that perspective and the broader human rights perspective to the forum. We have a good 15 minutes, 20 minutes for discussion. We want to protect the coffee breaks. Please address any of the speakers which we had. Let me remind you, Franz laying out a conceptual framework, conceptual thinking, how we at ZEF have, how our thinking at ZEF has evolved on marginality and addressing extreme poverty. Sajjad bringing in an analytical framework, helping us with theoretical, well-founded arguments. Andries clearly highlighting the need for poverty measurement, and speaking of the government and management of poverty and implications for agrarian change. Etisham providing the bridge between the fiscal, the macroeconomic, and the key role of the consolidated macro and taxation policies for addressing extreme poverty, and you just heard Katharina. We felt it's important that we get a complex mix of perspectives in the first session. So this is not random. I know it's a challenge. Conference later on is getting more segmented and structured. But the different perspectives put before you have all their logic. I mean, compare Katharina with Sajjad's presentation. Actually, I look forward to your questions to the presenters or to your comments. Raise your hand and let's three people speak, and then maybe we go back to any of the speakers. Please.
Yeah.
And I think people start remembering names.
Yeah, my query is for Jahir Sajjad. First of all, my compliments for your nice and very rich presentation. You try to define the marginality or the condition of being extremely marginal in terms of equilibrium. I was wondering what kind of equilibrium it is. It is stable or unstable. If it is unstable, then the task is easier for the policymakers or the people who design the response policies. But if it is a stable equilibrium, I don't know whether you would like to call them vicious circle of poverty, or it is problematic, and that will bring the issue that how effective or how forceful the intervention should be to disturb this stable equilibrium. In many contexts and disciplines, this stability is desirable and good, but not in this case. And what the neuroscientists sometimes call it resilience, that you disturb and it comes back to its original state. But if it happens when the situation is of extreme poverty, then we will have to rethink about designing of the response policies.
Thank you, Tushar. Who would like to go next? Yes, please.
My question is to Professor and you to talk. Yeah. This thing is jobless de-aggregarization. Okay. So I am not an economist. I am a public person. So as far as I know about this economic things, that this is a step towards industrialization, where you take up people from agriculture and try to put them in industry. So why things are not acting in that way? I mean, can you elaborate a little bit, please? Thank you.
Okay, we come back to that. Okay.
Yeah, I think the different perspectives were quite interesting, but I'm not fully clear about the definitions between poverty and extreme poverty. I mean, of course, poverty lines are, of course, problematic, but I think it is also helpful to have more clear definitions. What is the difference? And even then, among the extreme poor, there can be different groups. So, for example, in Bangladesh, depending on the year and the prices, if we take 20 euro cents per day as income, as one criteria for extreme poverty, or in terms of food, for example, at least 6 months in a year, maximum 2 meals or something like that, and then it can be differentiated again. Usually we are using three kinds of categories among the extreme poor, and then I think from the practical perspective, it is possible also to work with the communities and with the villages and the local government agencies, and to start the selection of people from the bottom, from the poorest, and not from the top. Of course, the whole structural issues are important, but still I think the individual situation is one important factor. And my impression was that this is not yet clear enough.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's a great question, and we shouldn't just define poverty lines downwards. We should also consider those who don't survive, who are no longer accountable. As an extreme poverty outcome, I think that needs to enter the concept as well. Ruth.
Thank you. This combination of perspectives was really very enlightening. It worked really well. One issue is that taking the perspective of marginality and contrasting a little bit Katerina's and Atisha's points, I'd like to put the question to Atisha of if we are transferring resources down to various municipalities or other kinds of localized institutions, that's well and good, but if the marginalized poor are alienated from those institutions, what are you also talking about doing to making those more accountable to the women, to the Dalits, to the other kinds of, of people who are excluded, so that you don't get morally captured with that rather than less?
Mm-hmm. What?
Thank you. This is a question, not question or maybe comment to presentation by Franz. I think what I feel that when we are interlinking poverty and social exclusion to marginality, we probably need to bring a lot more clarity on the concept of social exclusion. There are groups, there are individuals which get excluded from participation in development, and then there are groups where the poverty is extremely high, Dalit or tribe in India or many other groups in many other countries. I think there is we possibly have to bring what Gary Baker started, discrimination with respect to gender and possibly race, and then the concept developed in France of social exclusion only confined to certain physically and certain groups, but getting extended to poverty and other analysis. A.K. Sen's paper on the Asian Development Bank's paper on social exclusion, meaning and concept, that whole extension of it in Latin American studies. I think this group exclusion as different from that of individual, and how that exclusion denied opportunity and led to marginality and to poverty. I think we need a lot more clarity, I believe, drawing from the even existing literature on exclusion and its linkages with growth, its linkages with poverty, its linkages with denial of opportunity, and ultimately leading to a chronic poverty situation. We are talking about the most poor, not only poor, but most poor, and how exclusion plays the role in that.
Sule?
Yeah, my question is to Franz. You defined marginalized poor, and could you explain a little bit more the policy implication for marginalized poor and vulnerable poor?
Solveig?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the question of who are the extreme poor, we really come back, as what you said, to the question how to identify the poor. And usually national censuses, for example, they do not measure poverty because of the indicators they have. The indicators do not really reflect the reality of the poor, and very often cultural indicators are also not included. And I was working for a World Bank finance study in Indonesia that was quite 10 years ago, and we were trying to find out how to really identify the poor in Indonesia, and it was very hard because poverty is something different in different parts of the country, for example, and we tried to come up with a concept of the kind of embeddedness of the poor into different social systems, for example, and also the question of participation, which was very important. But I think, this is a crucial issue when it comes to the question of who are the extreme poor, to find them if you want to come towards policy and action to bring them on a stage that they can actually survive or better survive.
Krista, I think I have one more person thereafter, and then I will give the floor back to the speakers in the order which they spoke. Krista.
I have a comment on the concept of extreme poor and exclusion, and it relates to the MDG 1, which covers poverty, but which also covers hunger. And we need to be aware that the hunger indicator is the underweight of children. So we come into the whole nutrition debate. We are in societies where half of the children are chronically malnourished, meaning they are excluded from the development once they become adults because they cannot live up to their full potential. I missed a bit in all the presentations the dimension of child nutrition, because it's the exclusion of the next generation of participating in any type of economic growth that may take place.
Okay, we later on have a presentation from Tom on the child nutrition issue, but thank you for alerting us. I think that the nutrition issue is as important as the mortality issue. When counting who is there, you miss lots of others. Sudarshan, you wanted to come.
I just wanted to share that I tend to agree with Professor Ekdesham when he says that marginality actually is a function of poverty. Perhaps, defining poverty in its different dimensions would have been a better focus, and looking at marginality coming out of it as a resultant context.
Okay. Franz, would you go first with reflecting on any of the questions? And please, colleagues, be brief. In 2 minutes, coffee break was scheduled.
Okay, thank you, Professor Thorat, for your question, and Suling as well. I will try to answer both of them at the same time. When we started thinking about the concept of marginality and extreme poverty, and trying to write the paper, we also tried to go through this jungle of so many different definitions and concepts. I definitely agree that you are right. In each aspect and each dimension or each category, or however you call it, there could have been more investigation and a more comprehensive look into how social exclusion, for example, is defined and conceptualized before that. And the same issue is with vulnerability. Of course, there are many overlappings with extreme poverty, vulnerability, exclusion, and the scope of the paper just did not allow for drawing out all these overlappings. I think that what we have heard also from the presentation so far, and what we have learned in the countries on the ground, but also from the literature, is that we have a very diverse and a very complex picture of poverty and marginality, which we may need to look at more case-by-case study. Maybe I will leave it like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Sajjad, you were asked to clarify a couple of things.
Yeah, I'll take this opportunity to link with few other respondents. Thank you for that compliment and raising that question, which is obviously equilibrium here is not meant to be the simple demand supply thing. It's multi-agent, multi-objective functions in multiple spheres, and some kind of equilibrium is settled out there, which define the set of contracts between agents, and exclusion being a part of that equilibrium. And moving out of that equilibrium will obviously cause instability. That's a normal thing. Any change will mean some bit of instability. Whether it comes back to the original equilibrium or it moves to a next thing, in a very static sense, I'll reply, not really working out the details on it, is basically the change can come in through either introduction of new agents or dropping out of old agents, or changes in the objective functions of the agents, or in the resource base or endowments of the agents. That's in very general terms I'm saying. To give an example, I mean, if we put in money from outside, any external agency being philanthropic or claiming to be philanthropic, putting in money and creating pilot projects, once that is moved out, we know all that it ends up into another disaster. It goes back not only to the original thing, maybe at a lower level of the original. Now, whether we can bring about a change which is sustainable means what I was referring to the redefining a viable contract, which would involve new agency building, which may involve new program or product which is consistent with the interests of this new set of agents. So the emphasis should be on creating local level agencies who are organically, something that I thought Andreas was trying to raise, is the organic linkage of the thing rather than just a poverty line kind of notions when he was referring to a few of those things. I will just touch upon two small things which I think what Krista raised can be handled in the intertemporal thing, which is, there is a time contingent notion of service and commodities, and that is possible to be linked up. And what Sudarshan raised about marginality being a function of poverty, I thought there is another way of thinking through that all poverty is associated with one or the other form of exclusion. That is also, one can show that.
Okay, Andres?
Thank you, and thanks for some really interesting presentations and questions. Very briefly, thank you, Sid, for your question. I very much would question that de-agrarianization necessarily is a stage towards industrialization. In fact, in world history, it's been in the minority of cases that de-agrarianization has led towards industrialization. In South Africa, one of the things that's preventing development in the rural areas is the overdevelopment of the urban core, which now, I always tell students in South Africa that one of the most worrying things, one of the most worrying indicators that one finds as a rural researcher is that nowhere in rural South Africa, no matter how far you go, can you not get a cold beer. Now, you might like cold beer, but it shows you the power and reach of the distribution mechanisms of the corporate core, which squeezes out and crowds out any opportunities for entrepreneurs coming up from below. And I think that relates a little bit to my worries about marginality conceived only as externality. I think marginality exists on two axes. There's an axis of the extent of integration and the extent of externality, but there's another action which is the ability to, your access to social power. If you are highly integrated into the system and you lack social power, you are de facto in a situation of great marginality, in which your marginality is produced by adverse and exploitative inclusion. So I think we need to start differentiating between those two different axes. I think a fundamental issue is the embeddedness within social networks, and that helps us say a few extra things about what is extreme and what is not extreme. And we cannot simply define extreme in terms of life and survival being in danger. That is to sort of reduce it to very simplistic dollar a day, etc. kind of conceptions. The lack of social power is an essential part of extreme poverty. For example, a key aspect of indigence is the way in which it involves the denial of personhood to the indigent person. They don't have obligations. They don't just have status as a full person. In South Africa, for example, falling out of your social network, not being seen as member or a player in your social network is much more important in defining vulnerability and marginality than your extent of integration or not into the formal economy. So I think those are some useful directions in which to go in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Edishan?
I'd just like to second Andres's point about the importance of looking at the whole picture, not just money metric solutions. I think the question you raised is a very interesting one. I think some people in the international community think that just decentralization will solve its problems, and it doesn't. Basically, decentralization, if it is done right, if you have clear definition of responsibilities, own source revenues, information, and whether you can hold local governments accountable for meeting, again, legally, the objectives for which they get resources, then that's a possible solution. Short run, the answer is probably not, in most parts of the world, which means that you're stuck with central type transfers, but that's not a wonderful solution either, because the center doesn't have the information. And the ability to get the money out is subject to capture and clientelism. So really what you see is the marginalized getting more marginalized, because the criteria that people are judging against are overall poverty, not just looking at what's happening to marginal groups and their relative position. So, and again, as we saw in the West African case, the macro constraints lead to greater pressure. They put on people who have no voice. And I see that as a problem. We're looking for solutions, and I think the solutions come about by responsibility, accountability, and information. And there may be different solutions in different cases, because the institutional and political structures matter. So I don't have a magic answer, but I think that we have the ingredients.
Katharina, would you like to come back?
Yes. Thank you, Joachim. As I was saying in my intervention, I'm preparing a report that I will have to submit this month to the UN General Assembly on financing the realization of the rights to water and sanitation. And I'm looking at many of the issues that you are talking about, and I would be very happy to share with you a preliminary draft of my report, and if you have suggestions for recommendations that I could address to states, which are not only the states that are implementing the rights at home, but also donor states, UN agencies. I'm also making recommendations for UN agencies. I would be very happy. And what I think is very interesting is that, well, even though we come from different perspectives, well, the challenges that we see are the same, and the solutions that we see are also similar. When you talk, Etishan, about responsibility, accountability, information, this is pretty much a human rights language. It's what we say. Of course, it's not an immediate solution. We don't press the button and we see the result immediately. And of course, that can be frustrating. It takes time and energy and etc. What I constantly see, and that's for me the $1 million question, is what I constantly see is a lack. And this is what I think, Andres, you were referring to in your presentation, the lack of interest by policymakers, the lack of interest in investing in those people who have no voice, who have no visibility, etc. And how do we change this? I would like to know. How do we change this? How do we make the case that, well, it is worth investing in the poorest, in the marginalized, in those who have no voice. So thanks a lot.
Well, let me close with a couple of remarks pointing at two issues which may haunt us through the next 2.5 days. The distinction between poverty and extreme poverty will come back, I predict. that those who are stuck far below defined poverty lines have certain characteristics, structural characteristics. I think that issue is settled. The jury is not out there. We don't need to bring that back. A simplistic definition of a euro or dollar related, currency related poverty line and its change, I think none of us is advocating. But the further below the lines we are debating, the more complicated the issue gets. And we need to push ourselves into that sphere far below the line. The economics, the politics, the ethics, psychology of it, rather than debating around the lines, wherever we define them down. The second one, I think, will also haunt us. Is marginality a function of poverty? Is poverty a function of marginality? Of course, at the margin, it's both. So somebody who is by a catastrophic event, being it in the household or in the region, pushed into poverty can be marginalized. But for a large part, the marginalization in terms of the ecology where people live, the soils whose fertility is reduced, the seeds which the folks have no access to because the systems don't reach out to them, the rights not extended to them. These defining forces of marginalization drive into and keep people stuck in poverty, often of the extreme extent. So I think we can discuss both, and I would suggest taking aside that it's either or will not lead us forward, that marginality being a function of poverty or I think, Sudarshan, your point could have been interpreted apodictically as you usually are, like that. We will come back to that. We are all open to hear more, but for the moment I would suggest let's stay open to a simultaneous problem confronting us, marginality driving poverty and poverty being also a driving force of marginality. Colleagues, especially speakers, paper presenters, we give you one more round of applause. This will go on in the coffee break, which is now on. Thank you.
Meu Deus, estou me sentindo